Well, good morning. Thanks for that warm welcome. It's great to be here. I met Linda probably about 4 or 5 years ago. She was on campus, and we hold a job fair every year. In fact, it's going to be held next week. And Linda will be there. And we met each other, and we struck up a conversation, and just really enjoyed each other's company. And she kept on talking about Brookfield Academy, just how lovely it was. And so I told myself, wow, if I get a chance, I would love to come and visit one day, and today's the day. So if you get to participate, I hope it's worth all of our while. So, good, it works. So thank you.
Yay, good.
Good, so, good. So here's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to be talking about a wardrobe of images, and it's education and the cultivation of the moral imagination. So I'm a parent of 3. In fact, I talked with a few of you beforehand. My eldest is 21, and our youngest is 15. So we have a 21-year-old boy, and then a girl who's 19, and then a girl who is 15. So I care about education not just professionally, but I also care about it personally because of my children, as well as I know that you do because you're in this room. So I'm going to start with this. This is a book written by psychologist Chaim Janot called Teacher and Child. The book's okay, but in the appendix he actually has this amazing letter written from a principal to his teachers, and every year at the beginning of the year he would send this to his teachers and have them read it before they would begin the school year. And it addresses the purpose of education. So I'm just going to read it to you. In fact, I'm going to read a lot to you today, so I hope you like to be read to. I teach classic children's literature, and on the first day of class, I tell my students, if you don't like to be read to, you're in the wrong class. It's not like we're going to all gather on the carpet or something like that. I'm going to read to you, and then I tell them, you're going to read to me as well. So we often do that. So here we go. Here's what the letter says. The principal was in a concentration camp over in Europe and actually immigrated to the United States and was now a high school principal at a school in the United States. And this is what the letter says. Dear teacher, I am a survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no man should witness. Gas chambers that were built by learned engineers, children poisoned by educated physicians, infants killed by trained nurses, women and babies shot and burned by high school and college graduates. So I am suspicious of education. My request is this: help your student to become human. Your effort must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, educated Eichmanns. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are important only if they serve to make your children, to make our children more humane. And what's that talking about is in the field of education, education is more than just about the head. It's more than just the intellect. It's much more than that. It's also about the heart. When we talk about education at Hillsdale, we talk about the head. We talk about the cultivation of wisdom, but we also talk about virtue as well. When people ask me, so what is the purpose of education? I usually say the 3 H's. I usually say the head, the heart, and the hands, right? The intellect, character, but also what are you going to do with that education? How are you going to serve your fellow man? What skills have you developed? Linda and I were talking a little bit. I was browsing around on the websites, and this is quite consistent with other 5 stars connected to Brookfield Academy. If you read the mission statement, it points to the 5 stars. And the first 2 stars are intellect and character, right? The head and the heart. All right, so as I said, my wife and I have 3 children, so I care deeply not just about the cultivation of the intellect, but I also care about the cultivation of character in our children. And we, my wife and I, rely on a Jewish proverb, you probably know it well: train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. So we believe that in the rearing of our children, so let me tell you a quick story. So I care about that my children are becoming wise intellectually, they're understanding the ways of the world, but I also want them to develop the kind of character that we all want for our children. So when my son, who's now 21, was 7 years old, and my daughter was 5 years old, she's now 19, my wife and I, we don't like to helicopter parent. Right? So every time there's a conflict, we swoop in and try to solve the problems. We want them to try to negotiate their problems even while they were young. So I remember a particular day, my son was 7, my daughter was at 5. I was down the hallway and I heard a little bit of conversation going on, and it did not rise to the level where I would need to swoop in and solve all the problems. So I let it go for a while, but all of us know when it goes beyond that point and you realize, okay, this is a step too far, I do need to swoop in. So I walked down the hallway, and they were having a conversation, and I said, okay, all right, that's enough. And my son's name is Quinn. I said, Quinn, you need to go down in the hallway, you need to go into your bed, or into your bedroom, I'll be down in a minute, kind of a thing, right? So he went down the hallway, and I gave him a little bit of time to calm down and all of that. So I walked in, and I can still remember he was on his bed, seated there, and I kind of came in and sat down on the bed in a very parental kind of a way. And then I began to talk to him. And in the few minutes I had before actually going down the hall, I had time to formulate what I would call my exposition on the nature of teasing. So I began to talk to him about what teasing was, define terms, right? And then I laid out this beautiful argument from point A, counter-argument to the counter-argument. It was just beautiful, and I was going through, I'm not sure, but I think I could hear angels singing in the background. It's like, of my airtight argument on why teasing is a bad idea. And I remember looking at my son, who was still seated on the bed, and he had this expression. Now, to his credit, he was still looking at me, right? Or looking through me or something like that. And I was kind of awestruck. How could he not appreciate my airtight argument on why teasing is a bad thing? And I actually was a little bit kind of disoriented, like, and in a moment of inspiration, providence, I said this, Quinn, you're being an Edmund. That's all I said. Here was the reaction. He went from this, I'm trying to get it perfect. He went. Isn't that amazing? Where my beautiful argument on the nature of teasing and why it's so corrupt and all that missed him completely, but one name hit home. So, let me give you some context. As a family, we had been reading the Chronicles of Narnia, and we had just completed The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And Edmund is one of the characters, one of the Pevensey children. So here are the Pevensey children. It's a little bit blurry, but you'll be all right. This is Lucy. She's kind of the hero of the story, apart from Aslan. And this is the older sister, Susan. And then this is Edmund. Edmund is the liar. Edmund's the traitor, right? Edmund betrays his brother and sister. And this, of course, is Peter. We'll get back to him in a moment. So we have been reading this all the way along, and this is the White Witch, if you know the story pretty well. And this here is Edmund, and he gets captivated by the White Witch, and again, he's a traitor. So while my explanation of why teasing was a bad idea did not hit home, but that name did hit home, and why was that? I'll get to that in a moment. Around the same time I was reading this book, Tending the Heart of Virtue, by a guy named Vigan Goroyan. Let me just read a quote from this book. This is what he said. Mere instruction in morality is not sufficient to nurture its virtues. Now let me read that again. Mere instruction in morality is not sufficient. He's not saying it's a bad idea. We need to tell kids, don't do that. That's mere instruction. It's not good to lie, right? When a child is walking toward the stove, you want to say, don't touch the stove. But what he's saying is that mere instruction alone is not sufficient. What it means is you need something more. He says it might even backfire, especially if the presentation is heavily exhortative, in other words, heavy-handed, and if the pupil's will is coerced. And then he says this, instead, a compelling vision of the goodness of goodness itself needs to be presented in a way that's attractive and stirs the imagination. A good moral education addresses the cognitive and the affective dimensions of human nature. In other words, a good moral education appeals to reason, right? Rational ideas, but it also appeals to something else as well. Maybe something deeper in terms of the imagination. I had read this book before. This is Redeeming the Time, and it's written by a guy named Russell Kirk. Russell Kirk actually taught at Hillsdale, believe it or not. I didn't know that until after I had arrived at Hillsdale. Here's what he says. He says, what is the end, object, or purpose of humane letters? In other words, why do we read stories? Why? It's the expression of the moral imagination. Or to put the truth in a more familiar phrase, the end of great books is ethical, to teach us what it means to be genuinely human. And this was the first time reading his book, was the first time I heard this phrase, moral imagination. I'd never heard that before. So where does this term come from? Well, it actually comes from this guy right here who coined the phrase, Edmund Burke, in a book, Reflections on the Revolution in France, 1790. And Kirk cites Edmund Burke quite frequently. In this book, Edmund Burke uses this phrase, the wardrobe of the moral imagination. So remember that idea of a wardrobe, because we're going to come back to that. Okay, so what does it mean? What does this term mean then? The moral imagination. Well, let's take it in parts. Moral. What is morality? What is that having to do with? Only a professor would ask a student. What's his morality? That's like saying, what's the nature of ethics? Or something like that. What are we talking about when we say moral? What we're talking about here is goodness, right behavior, good and evil. Here's what C.S. Lewis has to say, the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, but in another book, an expository book. He talks about this idea of morality and what it means to be moral. He says this, there's one further point about the virtues that ought to be noticed. There's a difference between doing some particular just or temperate action and being a just or temperate man. Someone who is not a good tennis player may now and then make a good shot. It may even be a good player. I'm sorry, what you mean by a good player is the man whose eye and muscle and nerves have been so trained by making innumerable good shots that they can be relied upon. They have a certain tone or quality which is there even when he is not playing. Just like a mathematician's mind has a certain habit or outlook which is there even when he's not doing mathematics. In the same way, a man who perseveres in doing some just action gets in the end a certain quality of character, habits of character, you might say. Now that is the quality rather than the particular action which is meant when we talk of virtues. Is that not what we want for our children? Right? Not that every so often they do the correct thing or they do it in our view when we're watching, but that they actually have a habit of mind and a habit of character, that they act in the way that they should act even when no one's watching. All right. right, so what about imagination? Well, I'm not a psychologist. I know some, but I'm not one of them. It'd be interesting to have them try to explain what the imagination is. It's a little bit of a longer quote. It comes from a guy named Gene Veith in this book, believe it or not. And he actually in this short paragraph, he actually allows us or gives us an opportunity to do an act of the imagination. The word imagination does not simply mean making things up. Our imagination is simply an amazing ability to conjure up images in our mind. We do not think just in abstraction, we also think with our imagination. That is, we think in images, in tangible details that partake of our senses, even though we are only contemplating them in our minds. Our language, let alone our literature, depends on metaphors. We use metaphors even when we think in abstraction. And then he gives some examples. As when we talk about grasping an idea, a metaphor of a hand grasping onto something. Even the word comprehend, a concept, which is actually a Latin-based word, which means to grab with the hand. Right? We use a metaphor to even understand what comprehension means. Our power of imagination includes the astounding ability to call up experiences from the past. This is called memory. Think of a tree you used to climb or play around. So you can actually do this in your mind. In fact, yesterday in class, we were reading this article. And I had my students do this. I said, you don't have to close your eyes. I had them close them because I'm the professor. I said, close your eyes. And I read this to them. I said, think of a tree you used to climb or play around. You can imagine what it's going to do in the future. Think about the leaves on that tree will change color in the fall and how you will rake them. We can even, now here's the most amazing thing about our imagination, is that it's not just limited to memory, right? It draws on memory, but it's not limited to it. This is what he says. We can even imagine things that do not exist except as something we have created in our mind, and then he gives us a little bit of an experiment. He says, think of a tree. So I can think of a tree. He says, then make it blue. Now that's not actually hard for me. My grandmother, when I was very, very young, she had a blue Christmas tree. It was the ugliest thing. So actually, that's not an act of imagination. That's an act of memory, and it was ugly. It was so ugly. So while you are imagining this beautiful tree that you used to climb around as a child, and then it turned blue and it's gorgeous, I just have to go, like that. But he keeps going. So I'll do it again. Think of a tree. Then make it blue, now plaid. Isn't that amazing? That our human minds can do that? Now let me just try to pull a little bit back and explain to you about my plaid tree. The tree, when I think of the term plaid tree, and I've never seen one before in my life, but it is pulling from a memory of a tree that used to be on our property that I would play on. And then I have this weird experience in my mind. I can't even explain it. The plaid that I see is the plaid of the sweater that my dad used to wear when I was a child. I can't help it. And then it collides with the other plaid of the skirts that my two daughters wear at their school. Right? They have to wear a plaid skirt on Wednesdays, for example. My mind is drawing from those memories. In a powerful act of the imagination, it collides those things together. That is absolutely incredible. That's what we mean by the imagination. All right, so how then does the imagination form our morality and our understanding of how goodness, how we act in right ways? This comes from a book called Books That Build Character. It's by a guy named William Kilpatrick. And actually, co-author Gregory Wolfe graduated from Hillsdale College. So that's not why I'm quoting it, by the way. It's just a good paragraph. Here we go. This is what he says. Now, this is really, really important. This is the connection now between imagination and morality. He says, imagination is one of the keys to virtue. It is not enough to know what's right. It's also necessary to desire the right. Desire, in turn, is directed to a large extent by the imagination. In theory, reason should govern our moral choices. In fact, as a school, you want to be cultivating the rational ability of students. You want them to think critically, think logically. You want to cultivate that. But again, going back to Vegan Groyan's quote, that's not going to be enough. Right? You also need to do the affective. And this is what he says. He says, but in practice, it is the imagination much more than reason that calls the shots. Too often, our reason obediently submits to what our imagination has already decided. This was well understood by Plato, who had quite a bit to say about educating the imagination. Children, he said, should be brought up in such a way that they will fall in love with virtue and hate vice. So it's important, if we want children to be good, to act in moral ways, that we cultivate their imagination. This is what John Henry Newman, long time ago, said about the role of the imagination. He says, the heart is commonly reached not through reason, but through imagination. In this way, he's talking about the heart being almost the organ of character, right? But through the imagination, by means of direct impression, by the testimony of facts, events, by history, and by description. Again, going back to Jean Edward Veith, he says this is why positive works of imagination can be so helpful in shaping the mind. They provoke our minds with helpful images. The best stories can give images of goodness and render them attractive, making them something to which we can aspire. It is true that in this world, moral issues are often confusing and unclear. We do not always know for sure who the good guy and who the bad guy is in real life. And so we often have to deal with shades of gray. In fantasy, though, the contrast is sharp and vivid, and the conflict between them is heightened. Stories, particularly fairy tales, are especially useful in teaching virtuous behavior, more so than mere abstract principles, in other words, rules, and much more than slice of life intrinsically ambiguous moral dilemmas. We need to be able to imagine sharp moral distinctions to help us navigate in a morally mixed up world. Let me explain what he's talking about here. When you're shaping and forming children to understand who are going to go out into a world where it's not obvious good and evil, that's not where the world operates. It operates in this very, very far. It's hard to see what is good and evil. While they're young, they need these sharp distinctions of good and evil. And what he's arguing about here is that that's what a fairy tale identifies. So when our children are walking around, there's not going to be a guy in a black cape, tiptoeing, where we can say that's a bad guy, right? And there's not going to be a guy standing like this and holding up a sword. It's not obvious, but they need those kind of categories in their mind that they can draw from. And if all we're giving them are these morally ambiguous characters, they're not going to be well served to draw from those things. Okay, so then what is immoral imagination? Let me give you a couple of definitions from people who I trust. Again, going back to tending the heart of virtue. This definition is a little bit wordy, and then we'll get to a definition that's a little bit easier to swallow. This is what Vegan Groyan says when he wants to define the moral imagination. The moral imagination is not a thing, not even so much a faculty as the very process by which the self makes metaphors out of images given by experience and then employs these metaphors to find and suppose moral correspondence and experience. That's a mouthful. Let me translate to you. That the moral imagination which is being shaped all the time, by the way. Your moral imagination was being shaped when you drove here this morning, when you came up the stairs, when you walked, and it's always being shaped and formed. Right? So our moral imagination is always being shaped by the experiences that we have. And once we have those experiences, we rely on those experiences to make new moral choices. And he uses the phrase metaphor. When we encounter people, or when we encounter a story, when we watch a movie, our mind is making metaphors that when we encounter something new, we apply those metaphors to make moral choices. And then he says this after. He says, the richness or the poverty of the moral imagination depends upon the richness or the poverty of experience. As a parent, that is incredibly humbling. Because when I come home from work and I'm completely exhausted and I don't want to worry about the kids whatsoever, just grab an iPad and just whatever, right? And I have to realize that their moral imaginations are always being formed. So it shouldn't be paralyzing. You shouldn't be walking before them and erasing pictures, that they may see. Not that, right? That's not realistic, right? But as parents, as grandparents, as aunts, uncles, as educators, we need to be very, very careful that we are providing them with a rich experience, because it is out of that experience that they will make their moral choices. My mentor at Hillsdale College is a man named John Fennell. He has since retired. He now lives in Idaho. But this was his definition of the moral imagination. It's a little bit more user-friendly. He says this: the moral imagination is a store of images. Think back to the wardrobe. Right? A store of images. Images pertaining to ideas, principles, meanings, and possibilities, in terms of which one grasps the world and thereby in light of which one acts. But the way one acts is a synonym for character. Thus, the building of the moral imagination is the formation of character. And to the degree that parents and teachers systematically involve themselves in this activity, they are engaged in character education. So yes, character education needs to be courage. What does courage mean? Let's use courage in a sentence. What are synonyms for courage? That needs to be done, that kind of explicit instruction, giving students the vocabulary of virtue. But that's not enough. We need to stock their wardrobe with images of both good and evil, and this happens at a very, very young age. And the quality of the contents in that wardrobe will then reflect on their moral choices. I have a friend who says, the imagination allows us to see what could be. The moral imagination allows us to see what should be. Right? Not just what could be, what should be. Okay, so then how do we do this? So I don't know if you bought in yet or not. I certainly have. How do we do this? Well, let me give you some examples here. Emily Dickinson, a well-known American poet, she recognized the power that story had to shape our humanity. This is one of my favorite poems by her. There is no frigate like a book to take us lands away, nor any coursers like a page of prancing poetry. How's that for alliteration? Now, what she's saying here is a book, but what she really means is a story here. Right? And she's saying it takes us lands away. She's talking about transport to a different time and to a different place. That I can't go to 12th century China except through a story. Right? So a book, a story allows us the opportunity for transport. This traverse or this trip, this traverse may the poorest take without oppressive toll. Right? In other words, it's not even that expensive. It's embarrassing how inexpensive stories are today. You can go and get them at a thrift bookshop, great. It's embarrassing how inexpensive. How frugal is the chariot that bears, look at this line, the human soul. Literature is not just about transport. It's not just about, oh, wasn't that fun being in 12th century China, right? It's more than that. That story actually is a chariot that carries humanity. The humanity of the poet or the storyteller, the humanity of the reader, or humanity in general. Again, Kirk, here's what Kirk has to say about this. Fiction is truer than fact. I mean that in great fiction, we obtain the distilled wisdom of genius, understanding of human nature that we could attain, if at all, unaided by books, only at the end of life after numberless painful experiences. In other words, we don't have to cut off our thumb using a saw to learn from someone else's story of, be careful with the saw, right? Many painful, we can learn from the experiences of others. I'm sorry, I used that example. It was kind of out of nowhere. So in class, I explained, as a new homeowner, I was a little too arrogant, and I had a miter saw. I promise I won't go graphic. And I tell my students this, that I was doing trim, which I should never have power tools, but I was doing trim. And you know, like when you're cutting in, you're moving along, and there's that line that make sure your hand doesn't get closer than this, and I got arrogant. Right? Oh, don't worry, look, they're still there. So I'm there, and I'm cutting, and it was a smaller piece. I thought, oh, I'll just do it. It's inside the line, but I'll do it anyways. I put it in, I went down, and the saw grabbed the piece of wood and pulled it inward, and just in one motion, it went like this, and I hit against the blade of the saw. And immediately I just went, oh, I could be thumbless right now, right? And so I tell that story to my students, and they're all like, I'm never doing that. And you can learn from my ignorance and my stupidity. You don't have to lose an appendage, right? All right, so then he says this. Scientific truth, or what is popularly taken as scientific truth, alters from year to year with accelerating speed in our day. So scientific truth, right? What do they say? Every 5 years, science like doubles at least, and with the explosion of genetics, that may be even more so. And then he says that, but poetic truth and moral truth changes little with the elapse of centuries. To the unalterable in human existence, human literature is a trustworthy guide. That's why we can read Homer, and we can hear about a guy named Achilles, and we can learn what pride leads to. Do you know why? Because we struggle with pride. And the same struggle he was having is the same struggle we're having today. And we don't have to go through what he went through in order to learn from it. That's poetic truth. And literature is a trustworthy guide. This is Alistair MacIntyre, a well-known philosopher. I have a longer quote, but I'm just going to keep it short. He argues that man in his actions and practice is essentially a storytelling animal. And then he says this, it is through hearing stories about wicked stepmothers, lost children, good but misguided kings, that children learn or mislearn both what a child and a parent is and what the cast of characters may be in the drama into which they have been born and what the ways of the world are. One of the things that I try to communicate to my students is that you are all characters in your own story, right? And you interact with other characters in your own story. And this is what he says. MacIntyre actually offers a warning. He says, deprive children of stories, and you have left them unscripted, anxious stutterers in their actions as in their words. Hence, there is no way to give us an understanding of any society, including our own, except through a stock of stories. What he's talking about there is a wardrobe of images. That's part of moral education. Kilpatrick says a similar thing. Fortunately, there's no shortage of stories that challenge, thrill, and excite and awaken young readers to the potential drama of life, especially to the drama of a life lived in obedience to the highest ideals. Such books have something better to offer us than, he uses a term, therapeutic reassurance. Therapeutic reassurance is, whatever, it's fine. Everything's going to be fine. You'll be fine. Everything's fine. Like true friends, these books encourage us to be the best version of ourselves. They offer inspiration, something worth reaching for. Vegan Groyan says this: the great fairy tales and the fantasy stories capture the meaning of morality through vivid depictions of the struggle between good and evil, where characters must make difficult choices between right and wrong. Heroes and villains contest for the very fate of imaginary worlds. The great stories avoid didacticism, preachiness, and supply the imagination with important symbolic information about the shape of the world and the appropriate responses to it. So please don't misunderstand me here, that I'm not arguing for these heavily morality-based tales. In fact, there's a wonderful article that I have my students read on 3 ways of writing for children, where C.S. Lewis at the end, a well-known children's author says, don't start with the moral, because if you do that, your story is dead, right? Start with a good story. He said, I began with Narnia. I saw a fawn in a woods and a light post. That's where he started the Chronicles of Narnia. He didn't start with morality, right? If they're true human stories, morality will come in because we're moral beings. So you don't have to force it. In fact, I don't know whether you like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland or not. That's irrelevant. But one of the great images, Lewis Carroll preached against morality tales. If you know the story, do you know the Duchess? She's really, really ugly. And he says she has a pointy chin, and she stands up right next to Alice and takes her chin and puts it on her shoulder and keeps poking Alice in the shoulder with her chin. So not only is she supposed to be hideously ugly, but she's annoying as well. Do you know what her most common phrase is? In fact, over about 2 or 3 pages, she can't stop herself from saying, and the moral of that is, and the moral of that is, she keeps on telling Alice, and Alice will ask her a question, she'll give a reply, and then she'll go, and the moral of that is, in other words, Lewis Carroll is saying, don't be annoying, like the Duchess is. Morality tales are annoying. Don't start with the moral. The moral will come through. All right. This is a lovely book by Stratford Caldecott, called The Beauty in the Word. So you may be asking, okay, stories, great. What stories? Well, there's hundreds of them. As Kilpatrick said, there's many, many of them. There's no shortage of great stories. But listen to this quote. The Velveteen Rabbit, The Little Mermaid, The Wind in the Willows, The Snow Queen, Beauty and the Beast, The Chronicles of Narnia, which I teach all of these in my classic children's lit class at Hillsdale College. In fact, I wait to the very end to do The Wind in the Willows, and I tell my students, if you can make it through the class, if you can make it through nursery rhymes and fairy tales, because I'm hard, you get dessert, which is The Wind in the Willows, which I would argue may be the best book on human friendship in the English language. If you've never read it, and you're struggling with friendship, and you don't have any friends, that's terrible. All right, let me keep going. Reveal an aspect of what it is to be truly human, not in a moralistic way, spelling out the rules and regulations of right behavior, right? These are not morality tales, heavily kind of didactic, preachy stories, but in a way that educates the imagination of the reader to see patterns of linking character and decisions and events in the real world. It is not just a way of communicating these rules, but showing how these rules work, perhaps even why they work. However fantastic or unreal the landscapes in which these stories unfold, however untrue to life they may be in a factual sense, they are true in a deeper meaning of the word, in that they reflect the way things really are. They open our eyes not merely at the surface of things, but also their form. What he's saying here is the same point that C.S. Lewis makes on 3 Ways of Writing for Children, that these fairy tales are actually useful in that they draw students out of their world into a world where the rules and the laws of the natural world change. There are dragons, people fly, right? All of these crazy things, but it's interesting, the moral laws do not change. You will never see a character in a fairy tale who's rewarded for a lack of courage, right? Courage is always there. Integrity is always rewarded. Even if people can fly, dragons are around, and all of these things of the natural world, the moral world remains the same. So, let's get back to this. Remember with my son, I called him and I said, "You're being an Edmund." And here's Edmund. Now here's the interesting thing about this, is that when I said Edmund, images within his wardrobe came flooding into his mind. And that's what this was. Right? He didn't want to be Edmund. He didn't want to be associated with all those images he had with Edmund. But not only that, I didn't say Peter. I didn't say, stop being an Edmund, you could be a Peter. Even because of the natural connection between Edmund and Peter in the story, images of Peter came flooding into his mind as well. This is Peter. So do you know what the names of Peter are in the Chronicles of Narnia? Well, you're going to find out. Throughout all 7 books, these are the names used for Peter. Now let me just go through them. Sir Peter Wolfsbane. I mean, I could stop there. What little boy would not want to be called Wolfsbane? The bane of wolves. In fact, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Aslan allows Peter to rescue Lucy and Susan. He could have gone after the wolf and killed it himself, but he wanted Peter to be able to do that. And after that, he tells him, clean your sword, which is another interesting detail, right? But he says, clean your sword, and he knights him Sir Peter Wolfsbane. High King Peter the Magnificent, Emperor of the Lone Islands, Lord of Cair Paravel, Knight of the Most Noble Order of the Lion. Those were the images that flooded my son's mind at the same time, almost immediately, I'm sure, almost immediately after Edmund, because Peter was his hero at that time. In fact, this next image, it comes from the movie, but this is exactly what my son wanted to be in his own mind. I'm convinced of it. He's the oldest of 3 and has 2 younger sisters. This is what get behind, I will protect you. You know why? Because he's made comments like this before. Like, yeah, Dad, you can go ahead and go. I got this kind of thing. This is what he wanted. And why is that? Because this was a part of his moral imagination. Let me end on this. I quoted from a lot of expository literature, or expository works, a little bit of literature as well. I'm going to quote from a movie. It's actually based on a story by Tolkien. Tolkien has a lot to say about the moral imagination as well. There's a wonderful essay on fairy stories that's a very, very well-known essay. I would highly recommend it, where he talks about these issues as well. But in The Two Towers, there is this scene that's actually not directly in the book. It's actually, Peter Jackson drew from a number of different episodes in the book to create this dialogue. Some of you know where I'm going with this. It has to do with Sam, who I would argue is the real hero of The Lord of the Rings, right? He's the quiet one in the background, kind of. He's the one who's always faithful, always steadfast. Some of you may even know this speech, but this is what Sam says in the movie. says this, I know it's all wrong. By rights, we shouldn't even be here, but we are. It's like in the great stories. Notice how he's drawing from his own moral imagination. It's like, using a simile, it's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered, full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't even know how it would end, because how could it end, how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad has happened? But in the end, it was only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass, a new day will come. And when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you, that meant something, even when you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folks in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going because they were holding on to something. So, education is about the cultivation of humanity, and for children to become, as Russell Kirk said, genuinely human, they need a healthy and a robust moral imagination. This is an essential part of training them up in the way that they should go. So, in your capacity as parents, grandparents, aunts, educators, uncles, make sure that they have something worth holding on to, and even when they are old, they will not depart from it. So, thank you very much.